Have you ever found yourself judged unfairly, where assumptions seemed louder than your truth? Imagine settling into the most exclusive seat on a flight, only to be told you don't belong. Now picture the tables turning, unexpectedly and dramatically, within moments. This is the story of Camila Bennett, a woman whose quiet strength shattered assumptions and shook an entire system. You won't believe how this unfolds. Before we dive in, where are you watching from today? Drop a comment below, and if you're a fan of stories about resilience and justice, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps bring more empowering stories to light. Now, let's get into it. The hum of announcements and the rolling of luggage filled the air at Westbridge International Airport. Camila Bennett stood calmly in the VIP check-in line, her black blazer and fitted slacks a stark contrast to the casual travelers shuffling around her. Her quiet confidence spoke of years of perseverance and success. But beneath that polished exterior lay the remnants of countless battles, ones she had fought to stand where she was now. As Camila handed her boarding pass to the check-in agent, the woman behind the counter hesitated, just for a heartbeat. It was subtle, but Camila caught it, an almost imperceptible flicker of doubt in the agent's eyes, as if questioning how someone like her had ended up there. "Enjoy your flight, Miss Bennett," the agent said, her tone polite yet strained with a forced cheerfulness that didn't quite mask the disbelief. Camila responded with a slight nod. She was used to this. For years, she had grown accustomed to navigating spaces where her presence felt questioned, but today, she wasn't here to seek approval. As she approached the VIP boarding gate, a cluster of flight attendants whispered near the entrance. Camila's sharp ears picked up fragments of their conversation. "Think she's in the wrong line?" one of them whispered. "No chance she's in first class," another said under their breath. Camila's grip on her leather carry-on tightened. She resisted the urge to react. This wasn't new territory for her. When the final boarding call rang out, Camila straightened her posture and walked confidently toward the gate. She could feel the side glances from the older gentlemen in their crisp suits, their eyes narrowing slightly as she passed. But Camila kept her head high. The gleaming interior of the VIP section welcomed her as she stepped aboard. Gold accents and cream-colored seats created a sanctuary of quiet luxury. Camila settled into her window seat, carefully tucking her bag beneath the seat in front of her. Not long after, the cabin door clicked shut, and the flight crew began moving about, readying for departure. Camila couldn't help but notice one particular flight attendant, a tall blonde with her hair wound tightly into a bun. Her name tag read, Rachel Peters. Rachel's gaze lingered on Camila longer than necessary, her expression betraying her surprise. Camila ignored it, pulling out her tablet and scrolling through emails. She could feel Rachel's eyes still drifting in her direction, but Camila refused to acknowledge it. Moments later, Rachel returned, this time with a senior attendant in tow. His name tag gleamed under the soft cabin lights, Eric Donovan. Eric exuded the kind of authority that often masked insecurity. "Excuse me, ma'am," Eric began, his voice honeyed with false politeness. "We're experiencing a minor issue with weight distribution. For safety reasons, we'll need you to relocate to one of the available seats further back." Camila's eyes flicked up from her tablet, calm but steely. "You're asking me to move out of the VIP section?" Eric nodded, offering a strained smile. "Standard procedure, ma'am. It's not personal." Camila's lips curled slightly. "That's strange. I've flown with this airline many times and have never encountered such a request." Rachel, standing just behind Eric, chimed in with an artificial sweetness. "It's purely for safety, Miss Bennett. I'm sure you understand." Camila's gaze hardened. "I don't, actually. Are you asking anyone else to move?" Eric hesitated. "Well, no, but I'm the only one being asked?" Camila cut him off, folding her arms. Rachel's forced smile wavered. "Please, ma'am, let's not make this difficult. If needed, we can call security." Camila's brow arched. The air around them grew heavier. She could feel the curious and judgmental stares of the other passengers. The humiliation simmered beneath her calm exterior, but she wouldn't let them see it. "Go ahead," Camila said, her voice ice-cold. "Call them." A tense silence filled the cabin. Eric and Rachel exchanged uncertain glances, clearly unprepared for her refusal. Camila leaned back in her seat, crossing one leg over the other with effortless poise. From her bag, she retrieved her phone and began typing, her fingers moving with quiet precision. Whatever happened next, she wouldn't allow this moment to pass unnoticed. Her calm defiance wasn't just for herself. It was for every person who had ever been subtly pushed aside, every whispered doubt, and every unfair judgment. This time, she wouldn't yield. Camila Bennett sat quietly, the low hum of the aircraft engines filling the air around her. The plane hadn't left the gate yet, but tension had already taken flight in the VIP section. Her posture remained poised, her fingers resting lightly on her phone. She had sent the message minutes ago, no rush to check for a reply. Instead, her gaze followed Rachel Peters and Eric Donovan, now whispering a few rows away, their body language betraying their discomfort. Weight distribution. The absurdity of the excuse simmered in Camila's mind, stoking a slow-burning fire. She had read enough in her lifetime, articles, studies, personal stories, to recognize what this was. This wasn't about safety. It was about the sight of her sitting where they didn't think she belonged. Rachel returned, her steps careful but determined, as if she had convinced herself she was in the right. "Ma'am," Rachel's voice was sharper this time, though her confidence felt rehearsed. "If you don't comply, I'll have to escalate this further. The captain will be informed." Camila met Rachel's gaze with unwavering calm, tilting her head slightly. "Please," Camila replied, her voice even but firm. "Go right ahead. I'd love to hear his thoughts on this safety issue." Rachel's confidence faltered for just a breath. Eric followed closely behind her, his usual authority dulled by uncertainty. "Ms. Bennett," Eric said, straightening his uniform and adopting a formal tone. "Let's not turn this into something more complicated than it needs to be. We're just following protocol." Camila leaned forward, her voice soft but cutting. "I'm curious, Eric. What protocol specifically targets one passenger in first class for a seat change?" Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Or, are you implying I'm heavier than the other passengers?" Eric's face flushed instantly. "Of course not," he stammered, glancing nervously at Rachel. Camila's gaze sharpened. "Then what is it you're noticing about me that requires special attention?" Rachel's hands clasped tightly in front of her, her knuckles whitening as if she could press herself into the carpet beneath her shoes. "We're just," Eric began, but Camila raised a hand, silencing him. "I've flown with Arcadia Air more times than I can count," she said smoothly. "Not once have I been asked to move for weight distribution. Is this a new policy, or one enforced selectively?" The air in the cabin thickened. Passengers nearby had quieted, leaning in just enough to catch what was unfolding. Some looked away, embarrassed for the crew. Others watched intently, curiosity mingled with discomfort. Rachel opened her mouth, but Camila continued, her voice slicing through the space between them. "You see," Camila said, folding her hands neatly in her lap, "I've learned to recognize moments like this. Subtle acts, hidden beneath the veil of policy. Microaggressions masked as standard procedure." She let her words hang for a moment. "And do you know what else I've learned?" Neither Rachel nor Eric spoke. That silence is often the loudest confession. Rachel's face tightened, lips pressed thin as if holding back words she knew wouldn't help. Eric's posture slumped slightly, sweat forming along his hairline. He whispered something to Rachel and gestured toward the galley. Together, they retreated, leaving Camila in peace. Her phone buzzed softly in her hand. She glanced down, the message brief but telling. "We're aware. Stand by." Camila's lips curled into a faint smile as she locked her phone. She didn't need to say more. The gears were already turning. Turning toward the window, Camila watched as the sun dipped low over the tarmac, streaks of gold stretching across the horizon. The serene beauty outside stood in stark contrast to the discomfort lingering inside the cabin, but Camila let it wash over her. The momentary calm didn't last. Rachel returned, her expression tight, with a man in uniform trailing closely behind. His name tag read Captain Simon Rains. His professional demeanor was unshaken, but Camila could see the tension beneath it, the strain of being pulled into a mess he hadn't anticipated. "Miss Bennett," the captain began, his voice respectful but clipped. "I've been informed of an issue regarding your seating. I'd like to clarify the situation." Camila raised a hand, halting him mid-sentence. "Captain," she said, polite but firm, "before you continue, let me ask, have you personally reviewed the details of this issue?" Simon hesitated. His eyes darted to Rachel, then back to Camila. Well, I'll save you the trouble, Camila interrupted with a smooth nod. The issue isn't with me or my seat. It lies with your crew, who decided it was acceptable to single me out under the excuse of protocol. I trust you understand how unacceptable that is. A shadow crossed Simon's face. He nodded slowly, his professionalism masking frustration. I'll look into this further, ma'am. I would appreciate that, Camila replied, her voice cool. In the meantime, I'll remain exactly where I am. Simon's eyes lingered on her for a moment, then shifted toward Rachel, who avoided his gaze. Without another word, he returned to the cockpit. Rachel and Eric stayed frozen for a beat longer before quietly stepping away. Camila didn't watch them leave. Her focus returned to the fading sunlight outside, her reflection in the glass a quiet reminder of the strength she carried. She had faced worse, but today was different. Today, she had no intention of letting them win. Camila Bennett didn't watch Rachel and Eric retreat. Instead, she turned her attention back to the window. Her reflection stared back at her, a quiet reminder of the resilience she had cultivated over years of adversity. She had endured far too much to allow them to strip her of her dignity now. The plane sat idle on the tarmac, engines purring like a caged beast. Inside, however, the atmosphere was far from calm. Passengers in the VIP section exchanged glances, their curiosity swelling with each passing minute. Whispers carried through the still air, fueled by intrigue and speculation. Camila sat unmoved, hands folded delicately in her lap, her back straight against the soft leather seat. Outwardly, she was the picture of serenity. Inwardly, her mind raced, analyzing every step she had taken, anticipating what might come next. Behind the curtain that divided first class from the galley, Rachel and Eric hovered near the coffee station. Rachel's hand gripped a paper cup so tightly the sides began to cave in. She's not letting this go, Rachel hissed, eyes darting nervously toward the VIP section. Did you see the way she looked at us? Like she's waiting for something. Eric wiped his damp forehead with the back of his hand. We should have dropped it. What if she's someone important? She's in first class for a reason. Rachel scoffed, but said nothing. Deep down, doubt gnawed at her too. Camila's calm defiance was unlike the reactions she was used to. Passengers usually caved, driven by embarrassment or the desire to avoid confrontation. But Camila hadn't even flinched. I don't care who she is, Rachel muttered. She's causing a scene. If the captain won't handle it, I will. Camila's phone vibrated softly in her palm. She glanced at the screen. They've been notified. Stay seated. The message was simple, but Camila felt the weight behind those words. With a flick of her finger, she locked her phone and slipped it back into her bag, brushing her fingertips against the smooth leather. A faint flicker of satisfaction crossed her face as she turned her gaze back to the window. Her moment of quiet didn't last long. A faint commotion near the cockpit caught Camila's attention. Captain Simon Raines stood just outside the door, speaking in hushed tones with someone Camila hadn't seen before. The man wore a dark suit, his presence both commanding and understated. His expression remained unreadable as he listened to Simon, nodding occasionally. Camila observed carefully as the suited man passed a small card into Simon's hand. Simon's face visibly paled as he read it, his lips moving rapidly as if trying to explain something. Whatever was on that card had shifted the balance of power. Minutes later, Simon returned to the VIP section. His earlier frustration had been replaced by an uneasy calm. He stopped beside Camila's seat, his hands clasped like a schoolboy ready to deliver an apology. Miss Bennett, Simon began, his voice lower now. On behalf of Arcadia Air, I'd like to personally apologize for any discomfort or inconvenience you've experienced today. It seems there's been a misunderstanding. Camila arched an eyebrow, her expression cool and unreadable. A misunderstanding? Her voice was smooth, like glass beneath ice. Simon cleared his throat, glancing briefly over his shoulder at Rachel and Eric, who stood rigid at the edge of the cabin. Yes, ma'am, he said, his gaze lowered. I've spoken with my staff. This situation is not reflective of Arcadia Air's values. Camila held his gaze for a long, silent moment before leaning back in her seat. And yet, she said softly, it happened, right here, in your first-class cabin. Simon nodded stiffly. It did, and I take full responsibility. Before Camila could respond, the man in the dark suit entered the VIP section. His presence drew immediate attention. The whispering passengers fell silent, their gazes shifting toward him with quiet curiosity. He moved with purpose, each step deliberate, until he stood before Camilla's seat. "Miss Bennett," the man said, his voice deep and even. "I'm Nathan Cross, Senior Vice President of Corporate Affairs." Camilla studied him, tilting her head slightly but saying nothing. She waited for him to continue. Nathan glanced at Simon briefly, then returned his focus to Camilla. "I've been informed of the situation," he said, "and I want to assure you it's being addressed as we speak. On behalf of Arcadia Air, I extend our sincerest apologies." Camilla's eyes narrowed slightly, though her expression softened just enough to appear diplomatic. "Mr. Cross," she said, her voice slow and deliberate, "apologies are easy. Accountability is harder." Nathan inclined his head, acknowledging the weight of her words. "You're absolutely right, ma'am. Rest assured, this goes beyond words. The individuals responsible will face appropriate consequences." Rachel's posture stiffened visibly. Her earlier confidence evaporated, leaving behind an almost imperceptible tremble in her hands. Eric, standing slightly behind her, looked equally uneasy. "Appropriate consequences?" Camilla repeated softly, though the meaning beneath her words was sharp. Nathan allowed himself the faintest smile. "I think it's best we discuss further after the flight, Miss Bennett. For now, I'd like you to enjoy the remainder of your journey without interruption." With that, Nathan nodded respectfully before stepping away. Simon quickly followed suit, disappearing toward the cockpit. Rachel and Eric lingered near the galley, their eyes avoiding Camilla's, as the power dynamic in the cabin quietly shifted. Camilla turned back to the window, the golden glow of the descending sun casting long shadows across the runway. She had won this round, but she knew the real confrontation was still to come. Nathan Cross stood beside Captain Simon Rains, his calm presence contrasting sharply with the growing unease that filled the air. Camilla Bennett's gaze never wavered, her expression cool but deliberate. "Appropriate consequences," Camilla repeated softly, her voice measured but laced with an unmistakable undertone. "And what might those be?" Nathan's lips curled into a faint smile. "I believe it's best we continue this conversation after the flight. For now, Miss Bennett, I'd like you to enjoy the rest of your journey without further interruption." The weight in the cabin didn't lift, even as Nathan turned and walked toward the cockpit, with Simon following closely behind. Camilla watched them leave, but only for a moment. She turned back to the window, the fiery hues of the setting sun reflected in her calm, unwavering eyes. Justice had only just begun to unfold. Rachel Peters and Eric Donovan, pale and visibly shaken, avoided Camilla's gaze altogether. The shift in power was undeniable. Camilla said nothing, letting their discomfort settle as she refocused on the horizon. The plane finally lifted into the twilight sky, but inside, the turbulence lingered. Camilla's posture remained unchanged, graceful and composed, but a storm brewed quietly within her. This wasn't the first time she had faced such blatant discrimination. The sting of humiliation wasn't new, but this time felt different. This time she wasn't just a passenger, she was someone with the power to hold them accountable. A soft chime echoed through the cabin, signaling the crew's routine check-in. Rachel reappeared, walking stiffly through the VIP section. Every movement seemed weighed down by the awareness that each step brought her closer to Camilla's seat. Her usual confidence had been replaced by something fragile, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted a tray in front of another passenger. When she reached Camilla's row, Rachel hesitated, her knuckles whitened as she gripped the edge of the seat for balance. "Would you care for a beverage, Miss Bennett?" Rachel's voice was softer now, her earlier sharpness dulled by nerves. Camilla lifted her eyes slowly, meeting Rachel's with a steady gaze that made the flight attendant's breath catch. "No, thank you," Camilla replied, her tone polite but heavy with meaning. Rachel nodded quickly, her lips moving in a barely audible mutter as she continued down the aisle. The rest of the cabin remained hushed. The other passengers might not have known the full story, but they could feel something significant was unfolding around them. Camilla, however, understood the shift perfectly. It was subtle, the unraveling of authority, the quiet erosion of power when fear begins to replace confidence. Her phone buzzed again. Camilla retrieved it, glancing at the screen with faint satisfaction. Instructions sent to Captain Rains, execute as needed. She locked her phone and leaned back, releasing a slow, measured breath. Everything was already in motion. Now she simply had to wait. Behind the curtain separating the galley from the VIP section, Rachel paced in tight circles, her heels clicking softly against the narrow floor. Eric leaned against the counter, his face pale and his arms crossed stiffly over his chest. "This isn't just some executive," Eric muttered, barely above a whisper. "Did you see how the captain reacted? And Nathan Cross. He's corporate, high up." Rachel stopped pacing, her eyes narrowing. "So what? We didn't do anything wrong." Eric's eyes flicked toward the curtain. "Didn't we? You asked her to move. That's not protocol. That's discrimination." Rachel's cheeks flushed, her hands wringing together as she searched for a defense that wouldn't come. "She's blowing this out of proportion," Rachel whispered harshly. "She's trying to make a point." Eric's eyes darkened. "Maybe she should." Silence fell between them, broken only by the hum of the engines. The lights in the cabin dimmed as the plane settled into cruising altitude. A junior flight attendant emerged with a tray of warm towels, silently offering them to the VIP passengers. Camila accepted one, the soft fabric pressing against her palms like a quiet reassurance. She could feel Rachel and Eric's tension without even looking in their direction. It lingered around them, heavy and unavoidable. About an hour into the flight, the intercom crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Rain speaking. I hope you're enjoying your flight. I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge an esteemed guest on board with us today, Miss Camila Bennett." Gasps rippled softly through the cabin. Camila's face remained composed, though the faintest curve appeared at the corner of her lips. "Miss Bennett," Simon continued, "is one of Arcadia Air's newest executive leaders, overseeing operations and compliance. We are honored to have her on board as part of a routine evaluation. Please join me in extending our gratitude for her leadership." A heavy silence settled over the cabin. Rachel's face drained of color, her mouth opening slightly as if to speak, but no words followed. Eric's fists clenched at his sides as he stared at the floor. The other passengers exchanged stunned glances, their curiosity now evolving into admiration or dread. Camila gave the faintest nod in response to Simon's announcement. She didn't need to say anything more. The message had been delivered loud and clear. The dynamics in the cabin had shifted entirely. Rachel and Eric were no longer the enforcers of policy. They were under scrutiny, and they knew it. Minutes later, Nathan Cross returned to the VIP section, his expression calm but unyielding. His quiet authority cut through the stillness that had settled over the cabin like a heavy fog. "Miss Bennett," Nathan said softly as he leaned toward her seat, "I've spoken with the captain. We're prepared to address this situation at your discretion." Camila met his gaze, her expression giving nothing away. "Good," she replied simply. "Let's begin." Nathan gave a slight nod and gestured toward the curtain. Moments later, Rachel Peters and Eric Donovan stepped into the VIP section. Their movements were slow, their shoulders tense, as though they were walking toward their own trial. Passengers watched in silence, the curiosity that once danced behind their glances now tinged with quiet anticipation. Rachel stood before Camila, her posture stiff, her face betraying the panic she tried to conceal. Eric lingered behind her, his eyes fixed on the floor, resignation weighing him down. "Miss Bennett," Rachel began, her voice trembling. Camila lifted her hand, stopping Rachel mid-sentence. "Save it," she said, her tone sharp yet controlled. "This isn't the time for excuses." Rachel's mouth snapped shut, her eyes darting nervously to Eric, who looked as if he wished the floor would swallow him whole. Camila rose slowly from her seat, each movement deliberate. The atmosphere shifted, the entire section seeming to hold its breath as she addressed them. "This flight is an audit," Camila said clearly, her gaze fixed on Rachel and Eric. "Not just of protocol, but of integrity. And what you've demonstrated today is a failure, a blatant disregard for fairness, professionalism, and decency." Rachel's hands twisted the hem of her uniform, her carefully curated confidence unraveling. Eric's shoulders sagged, his eyes now locked on his shoes. "This airline," Camila continued, her voice slicing through the silence, "has no room for individuals who believe they can hide behind authority to justify their prejudice." She took a step closer, her words cold but precise. "Effective immediately. Both of you are relieved of your duties." Your actions will be reviewed further upon landing. But let me be clear, what you did today will not go unnoticed or unpunished." Rachel opened her mouth to respond, but thought better of it. The shame on her face was unmistakable as she and Eric were escorted out of the VIP section. Their departure was quiet, yet it echoed through the cabin with the weight of justice being served. Passengers sat in stunned silence, their expressions a mixture of shock and admiration. Camila returned to her seat, the tension in the air gradually dissipating like smoke after a fire. Justice had been done, but for Camila, this was only the beginning. The fight against discrimination wouldn't end here. It was a battle she intended to keep fighting, one flight, one confrontation at a time. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, yet the VIP section had grown eerily still. The murmurs and whispers that once flitted through the air like gossip had faded, leaving behind a reverent quiet. Camila sat unmoved, her calm exterior unshaken by the storm she had ignited. Through the window, the dark sky stretched endlessly. Her reflection stared back at her, a reminder of why she had refused to let this go. Exposing injustice didn't bring satisfaction. There was no triumph in revealing the cracks beneath the surface. It was a necessity, one that ensured others wouldn't endure the same. As the flight attendant quietly moved through the section, Camila noticed subtle changes. Passengers who had once dismissed her with sidelong glances now watched her with newfound respect. An older gentleman seated 2 rows ahead turned slightly, offering her a small nod of acknowledgement. Camila returned the gesture with the faintest of smiles. Not everyone, however, shared that sentiment. Across the aisle, a younger man in a tailored suit shifted uncomfortably. His eyes flicked toward her, and Camila caught the muttered words as they slipped past his lips. Overreaction. Playing the victim. Camila let the comment pass without response. She'd heard it before. This wouldn't be the last time. A soft knock at the curtain stirred her from her thoughts. Nathan Cross stepped back into the VIP section, his demeanor unchanged. He approached Camila's seat, pausing just beside her. "Miss Bennett," Nathan began, his voice low. "May I have a moment?" Camila inclined her head, gesturing to the empty seat next to her. Nathan lowered himself carefully into it, his hands clasped in his lap. "I wanted to thank you," he said after a brief pause, "for handling this with such grace. I've seen far lesser incidents escalate beyond repair, but you—" He trailed off, shaking his head slightly. Camila's gaze remained steady. "I didn't stay calm for them, Mr. Cross," she replied. "I did it for the countless passengers who don't have a voice to fight back. Someone has to set the standard." Nathan nodded, his eyes thoughtful. "And you did just that. I assure you, this won't be swept under the rug. Rachel and Eric's actions are already being reviewed." Camila's lips pressed into a thin line. "Words are easy, Mr. Cross. Accountability isn't." "You're right," Nathan admitted, "but I promise you, this is just the beginning." Nathan Cross's voice held sincerity, but Camila Bennett wasn't easily swayed by words alone. "Rachel and Eric's actions are already under review," Nathan assured her, his tone measured. "Policies will be revisited to ensure this never happens again." Camila tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing as she studied him. "There's potential here, Mr. Cross," she said, her voice calm but firm. "But apologies and reviews don't mean much if they don't lead to real change." Nathan nodded, his hands unclasping as he leaned back. "Understood. And on a personal note, your actions today have reminded me why I do this job. It's easy to forget the impact we have until moments like this." For the first time that evening, Camila's lips curved into a faint but genuine smile. "Let's make sure we follow through, Nathan." Nathan stood, offering a respectful nod before disappearing behind the curtain. Camila watched him leave, her mind lingering on his words. She wanted to believe him, to trust that his promises of reform weren't empty. But experience had taught her to temper hope with realism. The plane glided smoothly through the dark expanse of sky, the soft glow of cabin lights casting a warm, hushed ambiance over the VIP section. A flight attendant reappeared moments later, carrying a tray with a single dish, a delicate chocolate mousse. Her demeanor, noticeably more attentive than earlier, carried a subtle reverence. "With compliments from the captain, Miss Bennett," the attendant said quietly, placing the dessert before her. She disappeared as swiftly as she arrived, not waiting for a response. Camila stared at the dessert for a brief moment, the richness of the velvety chocolate, a stark contrast to the bitterness of the evening's events. She allowed herself a single, deliberate bite, an indulgence amid the quiet storm. Toward the back of the plane, Rachel and Eric sat slumped in the crew's designated rest area. The crispness of their uniforms now seemed wrinkled and heavy, their polished shoes scuffed by the weight of disgrace. Rachel leaned forward, her elbows on her knees, her head buried in her hands. "I can't believe this," she muttered, her voice muffled and bitter. "All because of one woman." Eric sat stiffly beside her, his jaw tight. "It's not just her," he said, frustration lacing his words. "It's the whole system. We got too comfortable thinking we could get away with this kind of thing." Rachel lifted her head, her eyes red and furious. "Do you think they'll fire us?" Eric hesitated, staring at the floor. "I think it's worse than that. We're not just getting fired, Rachel. We're becoming the example." In the VIP section, Camila finished her dessert and gently set the tray aside. She reached for her phone, scrolling through the flood of messages and emails that awaited her. One subject line caught her attention immediately. "Statement regarding today's incident." Camila opened it. The draft was polished, diplomatic, and carefully worded. The airline's official response outlined the steps being taken to address the behavior of the staff and prevent future occurrences. But as she skimmed through it, something felt lacking. The message was safe, too safe. Camila exhaled softly, her fingers typing with precision. "Add specifics. Accountability matters." She hit send and leaned back against the plush seat, her mind already calculating the next steps. This wasn't over. The reckoning had begun, but justice required more than a single moment of action. Persistence, vigilance, a refusal to accept anything less than meaningful change. The plane's engines hummed steadily as they began their gradual descent. The intercom crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Rains. We're beginning our approach. Please fasten your seatbelts as we prepare for landing. Local time is 8:45 p.m. and conditions are clear." The cabin lights dimmed further, bathing the VIP section in a soft amber glow. Through the window, the city lights sparkled below, scattered jewels against the night, a reminder of the world waiting beyond the aircraft's walls. Camila adjusted her seatbelt with quiet precision, her reflection in the window calm yet resolute. She hadn't spent the second half of this flight preparing for confrontation or retribution. She had been preparing for the statement she intended to make long after the wheels touched down. Her phone buzzed softly in her hand. Arrangements confirmed. Car waiting upon arrival. Meet in the executive lounge. The message from Nathan Cross was succinct but clear. Camila allowed herself a faint smile. The pieces were moving into place, but she wasn't leaving anything to chance. She had learned long ago that trust was earned, not given freely. As the wheels kissed the runway with a soft jolt, the cabin stirred to life. Overhead compartments clicked open, and passengers began shifting in their seats, eager to disembark. But Camila remained seated, composed and unhurried. Her presence alone was a reminder justice wasn't just about responding to what happened. It was about preventing what could happen next. Camila Bennett remained seated as the plane rolled to a stop at the gate. She had no interest in rushing to disembark. Let the others hurry. Her patience had always been her greatest strength. Moments later, Nathan Cross appeared by her side, his posture composed as ever. "Ms. Bennett," he said, with a respectful nod, "the crew has been instructed to wait until you disembark. If you're ready, I'll escort you to the lounge." Camila gathered her belongings with deliberate grace, rising from her seat with an effortless command of the space. As she followed Nathan down the aisle, heads turned. Passengers watched in silence, their gazes reflecting curiosity, respect, and perhaps a flicker of unease. She met none of their eyes, but she felt the weight of their stares. It wasn't the attention she craved, it was their recognition of the power she now carried. The moment Camila stepped off the plane, the usual flurry of airport staff was noticeably absent. Instead, a sleek black car awaited her on the tarmac, its polished surface reflecting the glow of the runway lights. Nathan gestured toward the vehicle, but hesitated before opening the door. "I want to assure you, Miss Bennett," he said, his voice steady, "that today's events will not be forgotten. We're drafting new guidelines for crew behavior, and I've personally overseen the disciplinary actions for those involved." Camilla studied him carefully, her expression unreadable. "It's a start," she replied after a pause. "But change isn't about words, Mr. Cross. It's about actions, consistency, follow through." Nathan met her gaze solemnly. "You have my word." Inside the executive lounge, the atmosphere was a stark contrast to the turbulence she had endured. Soft lighting, plush chairs, and curated refreshments created an environment of calm. Nathan led her to a private area where several members of the airline's leadership team awaited. Their faces betrayed a mixture of nervousness and respect as they rose to greet her. Among them stood Eleanor Drake, the airline's vice president of customer relations. Known for her sharp intellect and uncompromising attention to detail, Eleanor commanded attention in her own right. "Miss Bennett," Eleanor began, her voice smooth but sincere, "let me first extend my deepest apologies for what transpired today. I've personally reviewed the reports and I'm appalled by the actions of our staff. This is not who we are or who we strive to be." Camilla took her seat, her posture regal yet unthreatening. She listened intently, her gaze fixed on Eleanor, offering no interruption. When Eleanor finished, Camilla let the silence linger, allowing the weight of the moment to settle. "Your apology is noted," Camilla said, her tone measured. "But apologies without action are meaningless. What happened today is not isolated. It's a reflection of a larger issue, a culture that tolerates bias, whether conscious or not." Eleanor nodded, the seriousness in her expression deepening. "I agree. We've already begun addressing this at the core. In addition to disciplinary measures, we are implementing mandatory bias training for all staff. Our hiring and evaluation processes are under review to ensure greater diversity and accountability at every level." Camilla's eyes narrowed slightly, weighing Eleanor's words. "Good," she said. "But transparency will be key. This can't stay behind closed doors." Eleanor's brow lifted in question. "This incident needs to be made public," Camilla continued, her voice unwavering. "Not as a spectacle, but as a statement. Passengers need to know that you are holding yourselves accountable and making real changes." The room fell silent. Nathan exchanged a glance with Eleanor, who seemed to carefully consider Camilla's request. Finally, Nathan spoke. "We agree. A public statement is already being drafted. It will acknowledge what happened, outline the steps we're taking, and reaffirm our commitment to doing better." Camilla leaned back slightly, her expression softening just enough to convey approval. "Good," she replied, "because silence only empowers injustice." As the meeting concluded, Camilla felt a quiet satisfaction. This wasn't the end, far from it, but it was a beginning. Change was often slow and frustrating, but tonight she had taken a step toward making it happen. Later, as Camilla rode in the black car toward her hotel, the city lights flickered beyond the window. Her phone buzzed with messages, some from colleagues, others from friends who had caught whispers of the incident. She ignored them for now. Her thoughts drifted to something larger than herself. This wasn't just about what happened to her. It was about the countless others who had been dismissed, diminished, or made to feel less than they were. This was about fighting for a future where such moments were relics of the past. Camilla Bennett intended to be part of that fight. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Camilla's hotel suite, casting golden light across the room's modern furnishings. Outside, the city bustled with energy, the streets alive with footsteps and the hum of early commuters. Camilla stood by the window, a cup of coffee warming her hand as she gazed at the skyline. Her phone vibrated again, this time with a message from Nathan. "The statement goes live this afternoon. Let me know if you'd like to review it beforehand." Camilla's lips curved into a faint smile. She already knew what her response would be. Camilla Bennett stood by the window of her hotel suite, the soft glow of morning light filtering through the glass. Her coffee cup rested warmly in her hands as the events of the previous night replayed in her mind. On the table beside her, her phone buzzed intermittently, a steady stream of messages and calls. The airline's public statement had gone live just hours after their meeting, and it was already causing ripples. Camilla hadn't read it in full. She wanted to gather her thoughts before immersing herself in the inevitable media storm. Yet, glimpses of the statement had already found their way into her inbox through colleagues and allies. Setting her coffee down, she crossed the room and unlocked her phone. The headline stared back at her, Arcadia Air acknowledges discrimination incident, commits to reform. Camila tapped the article, her eyes scanning the text carefully. The language was measured but firm, acknowledging the events on the flight and outlining the steps the airline was taking. A public apology, mandatory training, and the establishment of a task force for passenger equity were at the forefront. Her lips pressed into a thin line. It was a start, but Camila knew better than most that statements like this, while necessary, were often met with skepticism, and rightly so. Words were easy. Change demanded action. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Camila crossed the room, smoothing the front of her blazer before opening the door. Nathan Cross stood there, as polished as ever, holding a leather portfolio in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other. "Good morning, Miss Bennett," he greeted with a warm but professional tone. "May I come in?" Camila stepped aside, gesturing him inside. Nathan placed the portfolio on the table and settled into a seat. "I wanted to check in with you personally," he began, his voice calm. "The statement's been live for a few hours. The response has been significant." Camila arched an eyebrow as she sat across from him. "Significant how?" Nathan opened the portfolio, revealing printouts of news articles, social media snapshots, and internal memos. He slid one across the table to her. A hashtag jumped out immediately, #FairSkies movement. It sparked more than just conversations about our airline, Nathan explained. Passengers are sharing their own experiences. Across the industry, there's a call for accountability that's gaining momentum. Camila studied the printout, her expression unreadable. "And how is Arcadia responding to this attention?" Nathan hesitated briefly, choosing his words carefully. "We're treating it as an opportunity. The CEO has approved a series of town hall meetings, direct engagement with staff and passengers. We're also fast-tracking the reforms we discussed last night." Camila's gaze lingered on the documents in front of her. "It's a good start," she admitted, finally breaking the silence. "But listening isn't enough. People need to see results." Nathan leaned forward, his tone earnest. "That's why I'm here. We need your input, not just as a passenger, but as someone who understands the broader picture." Camila tilted her head slightly. "Are you asking me to consult?" Nathan's lips curled into a faint smile. "I'm asking you to help us lead. Your presence on that flight was a wake-up call. It forced us to confront issues we'd been avoiding for far too long. You could be instrumental in rebuilding trust." The room fell silent. Camila considered his words carefully. She wasn't opposed to the idea, but aligning herself with the airline came with risk. Her reputation, her time, her energy. "What would this role entail?" she asked finally, her voice measured. Nathan gestured to the portfolio. "A seat on our advisory board, focusing on equity and inclusion. You'd propose initiatives, work directly with leadership, and ensure accountability." Camila leaned back in her chair, fingers steepled. The offer was tempting, but she wasn't one to make decisions lightly. "I'll need time to think about it," she said. "This isn't something I take lightly." "Of course," Nathan replied with understanding. "Take all the time you need. We're committed to making this right, with or without your involvement, but we'd be honored to have you on board." Camila nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "I appreciate that." Nathan stood, offering a respectful nod before quietly exiting the suite. As the door closed behind him, Camila returned to her spot by the window. The sunlight outside seemed brighter now, illuminating the city in a way that felt almost symbolic. Her mind drifted to the messages she had received, passengers thanking her, advocates voicing their support, strangers sharing their stories. They were why she pushed back. They were why she had stayed calm when the easier option had been to let anger take over. Camila Bennett wasn't just one passenger. She was part of something larger, a movement toward justice and accountability. And as she looked out at the bustling city below, she knew she wasn't done fighting. Not yet. Camila Bennett took a slow breath, turning back to her coffee as the morning sunlight spilled across her hotel suite. The fight wasn't over, but a quiet sense of resolve settled over her. She wasn't just ready for the next step, she was prepared to lead it. 3 weeks later, Camila sat at the long glass conference table in the headquarters of Arcadia Air. The room was sleek and modern, adorned with abstract art that seemed chosen to impress. Around her sat some of the company's most powerful figures, Nathan Cross, Eleanor Drake, and several other senior executives. New faces had joined them as well, including diversity consultants and legal advisors brought in after the incident that started it all. The atmosphere in the room wasn't tense, but charged with purpose. Everyone present knew they were standing at a crossroads. In front of Camila lay a thick proposal, filled with carefully crafted plans to overhaul policies, strengthen training, and implement a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination at all levels. She had spent the last few weeks collaborating with Nathan, Eleanor, and others to shape these initiatives. Camila wasn't interested in surface-level change. She wanted lasting reform that extended beyond symbolic gestures. Nathan leaned forward, his voice breaking the thoughtful silence. "Miss Bennett," he began, "before we finalize this, I want to thank you. Without your guidance and your willingness to challenge us, none of this would have been possible." Camila met his gaze, her expression steady. "Accountability isn't about one person, Nathan," she replied. "This document is a step forward, but the real work begins after this meeting." The room collectively nodded. The weight of her words hung over them, pressing each person to reflect on the responsibility now in their hands. Camila's presence had transformed the process. What began as a reaction to one flight had evolved into a confrontation with the broader, uncomfortable truths that lingered beneath the surface. This wasn't just about fixing one mistake, it was about reshaping the culture of the airline. As the meeting adjourned, Nathan caught up with Camila in the hallway. His tone was thoughtful, almost hesitant. "We've set the stage," he said, falling in step beside her. "But you know as well as I do, the hardest part is ahead of us. Are you sure you're ready for it?" Camila paused, her heels clicking softly against the polished marble floor as she turned to face him. "Ready isn't the word I'd use," she replied with a faint smile. "Determined feels more accurate." Nathan smiled, genuine admiration flickering in his eyes. "Then let's make it happen." Later that evening, Camila sat by the window in her hotel room, the glow of city lights stretching endlessly below. Her laptop balanced on her knees, she typed carefully, crafting an email to her network of colleagues, friends, and allies. The email wasn't just an update, it was a call to action. Camila outlined the progress that had been made, the steps ahead, and the work still left to do. Before hitting send, she paused. This wasn't just about Arcadia Air anymore. It was about setting a precedent, showing what could happen when people refused to accept the status quo. With a decisive click, she sent the email. Almost immediately, her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number appeared on the screen. "Thank you for standing up for what's right. You've inspired more people than you realize." Camila smiled softly, setting the phone aside. The work wasn't glamorous, it was exhausting, often thankless. But it was necessary. Every small victory, every shift, no matter how subtle, felt like progress. And that was enough to keep her going. The next morning, Camila boarded another plane, this time bound for a leadership summit across the country. As she stepped into the VIP section, she immediately noticed the difference. The staff greeted her warmly, but not with forced politeness or overly performative gestures. Their words carried sincerity. There was respect, not because of who she was, but because of what she had stood for. Passengers subtly acknowledged her presence, with small nods and faint smiles. It wasn't about recognition or status, it was quiet solidarity. Camila settled by the window, her reflection faintly visible against the bright morning sky. The plane ascended, cutting through the clouds, but her focus remained grounded in the work ahead. She wasn't just a passenger anymore, she was a catalyst for change, a voice for justice, a symbol of resilience. And this was only the beginning. What started as an act of humiliation had turned into a powerful statement of accountability and dignity. This isn't just Camila's story, it's a reminder of the strength we all carry when we stand against discrimination. If this story resonated with you and you believe in amplifying voices of resilience and justice, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Together, we can keep these stories alive and inspire the change the world needs. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one.